Welcome to the Healthy, Wealthy, and Smart podcast. Each week, we interview the best and brightest in physical therapy, wellness, and entrepreneurship. We give you cutting-edge information you need to live your best life, healthy, wealthy, and smart. The information in this podcast is for entertainment purposes only and should not be used as personalized medical advice. And now, here's your host, Dr. Karen Litzy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I am your host, Karen Litzy, and today's episode is brought to you by Net Health. So the fine folks over at Net Health are responsible for Redoc powered by XFit. It's a cloud-based, fully integrated EMR and billing solution. So it helps you to expand your visit capacity, improve your workflow efficiency. You get paid for your services, so you're not leaving any money on the table. It helps you to ramp up patient engagement to make sure that they keep coming back only when they need you. And finally, eliminate worries about documentation and compliance. So if you want to learn more about Redoc powered by XFit, hop on over to nethealth.com/healthy. Again, to learn more about Redoc and the complete revenue cycle management services, check them out at nethealth.com/healthy. All right, on to today's episode. As you all know, the month of August is all about highlighting other podcast hosts. And in this episode, I get to have 3 of them on. So I've got Brandon, F Scott, and Stephanie. They are all the co-hosts of the Healthcare Education Transformation podcast. And they were gracious enough to find a time where all 3 of them can come on together. And we spoke a little bit about their journeys in both their careers and in podcasting up to this point. And then from all of the interviews that they've done since beginning the podcast, we talked about what is physical therapy getting right when it comes to education, and what are some things that need to be improved that maybe we can do better. They had great insights stemming from their interviews and from themselves. So I want to thank Brandon, F. Scott, and Stephanie for coming on the podcast. And they'll tell you a little bit more about themselves in the podcast. So this intro isn't like a million years long. But I want to thank them very much. And everyone, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Hello, Brandon and F. Scott and Stephanie. Welcome to the podcast. So now you're on the other side of the microphone. So welcome to all of you. And before we get started, I'll have each of you just talk a little bit about yourself. So Brandon, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Well, Karen, again, thank you so much for the opportunity to just speak with you and your listeners today. And thank you for all the work that you've done through Healthy, Wealthy, Smart, as you've definitely been one of the innovators with podcasting in the PT world. So I have very high respect for you and what you've done. A little bit about me. My story is really not that super exciting. I graduated in 2015 from DPT school from Northern Illinois University. After that, I kind of realized I really liked this girl, and she was going to medical school in Michigan. So I was like, well, I kind of better make a move there if I want to make something happen of it. So I went to Michigan in the Detroit suburbs for a couple of years, worked at a hospital outpatient job, so doing a lot of ortho neuro and kind of figuring out a couple things. But then after that, she ended up getting matched to her residency program for surgery in Richmond, Virginia here. So I've been here for about the past year. And part of the stuff that I kind of like to do right now is I'm mostly looking to kind of be a clinician. I'll be starting fellowship soon. So I'm excited to start that training because ultimately I want to be the best clinician I can be and ultimately do something within education to contribute to making things better for the next generation.
Awesome. And F. Scott, I'll have you take the mic next.
Sure. My story is a little bit more of a journey that probably most people don't take when becoming a physical therapist. I was an English major at Wake Forest, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life until my senior year. I had so much free time that I took bowling, golf, and intro to Japan, and just had so much free time I needed to fill it. So I started volunteering at the hospital there in Winston-Salem, which was great. They put me in the PT department, but I didn't have any of the prereqs after looking at how to become a PT. So I had to take another year of classes just to get all my prereqs in, where I was finally able to get into East Carolina University. I did my master's program there, and I was actually the first year where they offered a transitional doctorate. So I said, that sounds great. I think that's the direction the field is heading. I think I should do it. So I started it there at ECU. But then my life kind of got in the way and threw me a curveball there. My dad had gotten sick, and he had some heart problems, and he ended up passing away. And I wasn't able to complete the program at ECU in time before the window of opportunity closed, at which point I just wanted to travel and get away from Charleston for a little while and kind of find myself. And while I was doing that, I applied to St. Augustine's transitional doctorate and ended up finishing my transitional doctorate there, which while I was there, the head of the educational program at the time, the educational doctorate, asked if I wanted to teach at all. And, I said, no, my dad was an English teacher and I didn't really enjoy a lot of his classes. So I don't think it's for me. But, they kind of said, well, some of the classes you took kind of overlap, so you could shorten the program up a little bit. Just think about it. And I did. I did some thinking on it. And I figured if my back goes out or my hands go out or I just can't perform manual therapy anymore, I could at least go into teaching. So fast forward 3 or 4 more years, and here I am trying to finish up my dissertation and still trying to figure out what I want to do with this educational doctorate, because I'm not sure that I fit the traditional academia mold. But, that's kind of what led me to Brandon and the podcast. And so that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Oh, that's a great story. I'm sorry about your dad.
Yeah, it was, like I said, it was somewhat unexpected, but at the same time, it was one of those things where we knew he had to have surgery or else it was going to end up in a bad outcome anyway. But it's definitely helped kind of shape my path, which, somewhat unintentionally, but at the same time, I think it's also led me to a lot more opportunities because of the directions that I've taken since. So, like I said, it's been a weird, winding journey, but I've enjoyed most of the journey up until now anyway.
Well, that's good. That's good. That's quite a story. I didn't know any of that. So thanks for sharing. And how about you, Steph?
So I graduated from PT school in 2015. I graduated from Washington University in St. Louis. And while going to PT school, I actually took a year off and got a master's degree in clinical investigation and got to do a whole entire year of research, which was really, really awesome. And after doing that year of research I really realized that, one of the things I wanted to do in physical therapy is not only contribute to the literature of physical therapy, but also educate not just patients, not just students, but the general public on what we do. And so when I graduated from PT school, I moved to Minnesota and North Dakota area and started working in a rural practice. Got very involved in advocacy, and I've been involved in advocacy since I was a student, and did a lot of educating policymakers and people within my community about what physical therapy can offer and how we can help improve healthcare costs and quality. So that's a lot where my education came in. Along the way, I started teaching students. So I was a clinical instructor, and that kind of started showing me that something I would really like to do someday is get into education. Those opportunities kind of expanded into some speaking opportunities within different conferences. And while doing that, I realized that, oh my gosh, like I really love inspiring people to really be the best that they can be. And so that's when Brandon kind of came to me. I've only been on this podcast now since about February, and asked if, maybe we could bring in the APTA audience a little bit more into our podcast, and started getting involved in the Healthcare Education Transformation podcast. And so that's kind of been my journey into podcasting. If you would have asked me if I was going to be doing a podcast even a year ago, I would be like, well, I don't know anything about podcasting. So it's been a really great experience, and it's really expanded kind of on that mold and my mission to really educate people on what physical therapy does, what physical therapy is, and how we can really help healthcare become the best that it can be.
Awesome. And I think if you asked any one of us if we ever thought we would be hosting a podcast one day, I'm sure we can all definitively say no.
Amen.
Absolutely. Yep.
I think it's a big no. All right. So Stephanie, you mentioned the podcast. So this whole month, I'm bringing on different podcast hosts from physical therapy and from outside of physical therapy. to highlight different podcasts and different hosts. So you three are the hosts of the Healthcare Education Transformation podcast. So can you tell the listeners a little bit more about your podcast and the mission behind it?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back just a little bit to kind of give some context on how it was actually formed. So to kind of dig into more of my story a little bit more, because I didn't go into this detail initially, but working my first job in outpatient, hospital-based outpatient, I'm not going to lie, I really, really struggled those first few months. Like I got frustrated, burned out. I felt like I wasn't prepared. I felt like I wasn't happy anymore. And I was reading all the books, and I didn't do any social media or any of that other stuff at that time because I just said, well, the stuff in school has to be right? And I was wrong. But anyway, I was so close to actually getting out of the profession that one day I actually was on our DPT students, not the DPT students grade, but our university program page. And one of my colleagues said, you guys should listen to this podcast. This guy is awesome. And it was actually PT on Ice. And I'd never heard of it before. So I listened to this guy and I'm like, oh my gosh, like he is saying everything that I'm thinking. He is saying every problem that I'm having. He's answering the things that are really giving me those issues. I'm like, oh my God. So I started listening to him, Greg Todd, yours, and a few others too. And honestly, podcasting is really one of the few things that kind of helped pull me out of frustration, because before then I applied for residency, didn't get it. I felt like I was kind of like crushed, and I was actually really close to getting out, but thankfully I didn't. So then to add to another level of that, in PT school, I had always loved being a CI in clinic. Like of all the opportunities in PT school, being a CI to a second-year student in our school's clinic was the most fun that I had in those entire 3 years. So I'm like, okay, I know I'm going to do this at some point. I'm not ready yet because I need to figure out what the heck I'm doing first and get a good system down. But once I feel ready for that, that's something I'd love to pursue. But I've always been like, do I want to go another level? Do I want to teach formally? Do I want to do other stuff too? But I don't know how to really find out about what that's about, if that's right for me, what that entails. And I love podcasts. And I don't see a podcast that's really devoted specifically to this area. I mean, there are some episodes here and there. Don't get me wrong. There is some stuff out there, but it's not all kind of saturated and kind of confined in one region that's always easy to find. So I kind of had this thought one day back in April of 2017, and I was like, what if we did a podcast on this, just hypothetically? So then I sent messages out to some people, including Ben Fung and a few others, and they're just like, oh, you should totally do that. That'd be really good. And I'm like, oh crap, that means I have to do this now. So Ben actually said, you should reach out to this guy because he's got some similar frustrations, and I think you two would make a good team, hence F Scott. So the big reason behind our mission is we did this because we both kind of felt frustrated and we felt kind of lost to a degree in terms of what we want to do from our personal side with a career, like with terms of pursuing a career in education. So part of it is we want to really make sure that we can target individuals that have some interest in learning about how to be an educator formally, whether that be a clinician, instructor, like a CI, professor, CEU teacher, whatever the role may be, to kind of really learn the ins and outs and find more information about that in kind of like the real world setting, not just what I can just read online from something that's not giving me the most relevant up-to-date stuff. But then also B is we both kind of felt a little bit frustrated with healthcare education from what we went through. And we're not experts on this. We're not trying to be, but we want to try to learn more about healthcare education by talking with people within those settings, but also talking about how can we really talk about bringing forth some solutions to really make things better. So those are the two main goals behind our podcast and why we started it.
Great. Yep. Scott?
Yeah, for me, I think it was, again, like Brandon said, being frustrated with the healthcare education system that I had gone through, and then being involved in an educational doctorate. And again, like I mentioned, not knowing where I wanted to go with it. So, I was going to try to figure it out by having on guests that have done things with terminal degrees or, not terminal degrees even. And how did they kind of navigate the waters of healthcare education? And I think at first I was afraid to admit that I didn't know where I wanted to go with an extra $40,000 terminal degree, right? It was kind of a scary thing to come to terms with. But after having a lot of these experts on, it kind of put me at ease seeing that there's so many different avenues and there's so many different ways to leverage, any of your degrees that really you just have to start kind of thinking outside the box a little bit. And it was comforting hearing these experts and knowing that at first I almost experienced, a sense of just overwhelm and like, how am I going to go into these large systems and try to change healthcare education by myself as one guy from the inside out? And I think, by having the experts on to talk about their particular niche, that it just made me feel like there are other people out there trying to fight the good fight and trying to do the right thing. And it's great to know that I don't have to know. I can just ask these people who do know and get some really great insight on, what's working and what's not. And really, help use that to help guide me and make my decisions moving forward as I try to navigate through these degrees. And I think one of the key things here is, if we look at the podcast as a whole, we now have 3 co-hosts. We have myself, who's always been kind of relatively anti-academia and 1 foot out of the boat, Brandon, who's kind of been unsure and in the middle, and then Stephanie, who's been a little bit more pro-academia and pro-APTA. So the 3 of us combined have really actually been a great fit for the show, and I think it's helped really mold things in a great direction and helped accelerate it over the last couple months for sure.
Awesome.
And I would say, I remember when Brandon messaged me on, I can't remember if it was Twitter or Facebook, asking me, when they started this podcast, if this is something that I would ever be interested in, or if, there were people that I could recommend that could be on the podcast. And I remember thinking, wow, like really nobody is paying attention to healthcare education. This is not a podcast topic that I'm familiar with. And so when they started the show, I definitely started listening to it and was quite impressed with the quality of the interviews, the quality of the guests. And then when Brandon and Scott asked if I wanted to be a part of it, I was just like, wow, me? Like, you want me to help with this? And one of the reasons I wanted to get involved was because I have heard so many of the same stories that Brandon just told me or told us, and that F Scott just told us, from my friends and other colleagues within APTA and outside of APTA who are especially new graduates and really don't know where to go after they graduate from school, because there's kind of this weird like limbo that a new graduate has. So as a student, especially if you're involved in APTA, you have like this great family, all these PTs saying, oh yeah, I'm so excited that you're involved. Let's get you more involved. Like here's some advice. And then you graduate from school and it's like, well, you're not a part of the student assembly, yet people tell you that you need to gain more experience in order to be on committees, in order to be involved in certain things. So like, where do you go? And I think that that's one of the things that this podcast has really helped me better communicate with people, that just because you are a new graduate, or because maybe you feel like you're in a burnout situation, or you don't really have a place that you're not inspired by physical therapy anymore, there's always a new place that you can go. And here, let us help you find that new place. And a lot of it has to do with educating other people about what we do, about what you do. And that's not just in the academic realm, that's in other realms of healthcare as well. And so that's kind of the reason that I wanted to be involved in this podcast, and some of the lessons, I guess, that I have learned from being involved within the last couple months that I've been here.
Yeah, that's a great point, Steph. And one of the things that I love doing is just telling people, oh, we've got an episode for that. It's like when people say, oh, you should try this or this, oh, there's an app for that. Well, it's cool to say like, and reference like, oh, I think we've got an episode on that. Check out this number, or like this episode. It's great to just be able to easily refer people to what they're looking for if they're looking for answers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that is when you have as your catalog grows and you have more topics and more guests, it's really great that you can say, something, why don't you listen to this episode? I think it might help clear some things up for you. And that's great. I love when I'm able to say that as well. It's really fun. And now, F. Scott, so you alluded to a little bit when in talking about the podcast, that, you talk about what works and what doesn't work. So all three of you have interviewed a lot of different people in the physical therapy world and outside of the physical therapy world within the confines of education. So let's stick to physical therapy for now. So what is working education-wise in the physical therapy world? We'll start out with what is working, and then we'll, after that, go into maybe what can be improved.
Yeah, so the final question that we ask all of our guests on the podcast is, if you could change one aspect of higher education, whether it be DPT or other healthcare related, what aspect would you change and how would you go about changing it? And I think really that's been the root of our episodes, is to try to get down to that question from the experts and hear what their opinion is. And I think realistically, for me, the biggest one that I've kind of latched onto, and this isn't the most popular answer. I think I'll leave the most popular answer for Brandon there, but the one that I've kind of latched onto is that there's been a wish for more interprofessional communication and collaboration, trying to break down the silos between, basically different healthcare fields and different healthcare providers. And I think that's what we tried to do with our podcast. And I think that's what I'm trying to do. I know as a professional, I'm trying to do more collaborations with people outside of the field of physical therapy. And I think I'm trying to do things that are, maybe out of my comfort zone a little bit, but at the same time, I know it's going to make me a better professional, and I know it's going to make me a better provider, of healthcare. So I think realistically that I know we're kind of going down the negative route on this side, but that I think is one of the things that people wish that they were seeing more of. Is just that interprofessional collaboration. And I know there's some programs out there that are trying to do it, but I think realistically, we've still got a little bit of ways to go on that one.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. I'm pretty sure that's what I said during my episode, was that more interprofessional. And what about Steph or Brandon? Like, what do you think are maybe some things that need to be? So let's start with things that need to be improved, and then we'll end with the strengths. So we'll end on a high note. That works better anyway.
That'll work. So I'll kind of go. So honestly, there's a lot of things that our guests have said throughout the podcast, and I think they all have a lot of merit. And I think that a lot of them bring up some many, many good points. So I don't want to just say my number one as it is right now is the only one. So I will say the one that's definitely the most common among all of them, because I think that this answer and this problem plays a big role in a lot of the other problems as well, to a degree. And that is regarding the financial outlook on it. So especially with the cost of education, which means students are going to have a lot more debt. That means when they get out, they have to take those jobs that maybe pay a lot, that maybe are not the best environments to work in. Then it's more straining on doing any other sorts of professional development. And it's even within academia too. I mean, we can't deny that finances are involved and run a lot of it too. So I don't know what the absolute solution is for that for sure. And I know a lot of guests have given some good, unique ideas yet. But I think from a problem standpoint, I think that drives a lot of what we do and a lot of our decision making behind that. So that, if I could say that for in terms of some of the big problems, I would say that's probably one of the biggest ones I've really come across. And I think that's something that we've all kind of experienced as well. I think that'd be my answer. Steph, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, the most popular answer, as Brandon said, is the debt crisis. I would say this is a relatively popular answer, probably not the most popular answer, but I would just say that trying to improve problem solving and critical reasoning within the student population is really important. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that potentially our profession is growing. We're opening a lot more programs, and some of the newer programs don't have a lot of the resources that maybe some of the more established programs have. And so teaching to the NPTE versus teaching towards critical thinking skills or clinical reasoning skills is a big issue that we have heard come up on the podcast. So I would say that that's something that I would like to see change in healthcare education, that potentially we've had guests who have had great solutions for that, and hopefully someday that's something that will happen.
And can we quickly talk about some of the solutions to each one of your descriptions of weaknesses within the education? So I'll have Steph, why don't you take it first? So what are some possible solutions to this critical thinking and clinical reasoning conundrum?
So one of the probably most popular proposed solutions is the implementation of a mandatory residency. Of course, then you get into the problem that Brandon described earlier, which is the debt crisis. And that is, so, it's kind of like a double-edged sword. Being in a residency does allow an extra year of mentorship. So it does potentially allow for people to develop those clinical reasoning skills. The other solution that guests have proposed have been improving clinical education. There are, just as many probably good clinical instructors as there are bad clinical instructors. And it's really unfortunate when a student gets put into a situation where the clinical instructor sees them as somebody that can just treat their patients and improve their productivity, thereby improving profits, versus using that experience as a way to improve the profession and help mold that person into being an amazing clinician. And that's something that I think is so important as a clinical instructor, is you should be more worried about how the student perceives you as a teacher than the student is perceiving how you perceive the student. Because in the end, you're going to be one of the reasons why that student is able to be an independent practitioner and is able to problem solve and clinically predict clinically reason through patient problems. So those are the two solutions that I think are probably most common to that one problem.
Yeah, and then that solution, let's say we're talking mandatory residencies, which was proposed but did not gain any traction. And I just spoke with Eric Robertson the other day, and we spoke about this as well. So then one of the big reasons is because of, the debt, number one. Number two, there are not enough residency programs to handle all of the graduates. It is a numbers game and the math does not work. So then you're talking about having to develop tons of new residency programs. So then how do you then oversee that all those residency programs are up to par and so on and so forth? I think you start going down a rabbit hole, but Eric did talk about that. So Brandon, let's go now to some solutions for the cost and student debt issue of healthcare education or PT education.
Yeah, and I'll say with some of the bigger ones that I've kind of heard in terms of how's the best way to address that. So the first and foremost one that really seems to come to mind is shortening DPT education to 2 years to the didactic model. And then their last year, they're kind of in more of a paid internship where they actually get paid for their time. And it's kind of like setting them up for residency. To me, that really seems to make a lot of sense. I think we're also seeing an emergence of a lot of other online learning modules and methods as well. So I think that's going to improve the accessibility too, rather than having to go into just being in a traditional classroom all the time. So I think that's going to solve a lot of other things that way. We actually heard not too long ago from Janet Besner. She had this actually really unique idea that I frankly had not heard of before, and I don't know how the logistics of this play out, but seeing how to get DPT programs maybe associated and accredited without being a part of a university. So that, because ultimately we've learned from others is that it's not the DPT program that necessarily sets the cost. It's the people and the finances above them. So and I thought her idea was really unique in terms of how can maybe we, if it's an option to start to look into us being maybe separate from a university and could that maybe change the cost value of that too? So, I mean, those are two absolute big ones for sure. And there's a lot of other things too. But I think a lot of our guests honestly have been kind of afraid to go at this topic because I think a lot of them, it's out of their control. And I think there's definitely a lot of people that realize that it's a problem and it needs to be addressed. But I think it was interesting. One of our guests kind of said this off the record that, they're charging all that money because they can and they can get away with it. I mean, if they have the supply of students that are willing to pay for it, what's the incentive for them to stop doing that?
Yeah.
Because they're not getting funding from the state either.
Right. No incentive.
Mm-mm.
Another difficult part is that if you're coming right out of high school and you want to be a physical therapist, I think it might be a little bit easier for you to plan because maybe you won't go to the fancy, expensive private school, but you'll go to your state school and maybe pay a couple thousand. I don't know how much a state school is. I'm from Pennsylvania. I think my sister paid like $5,000 a year to go to Penn State as a Pennsylvania resident. So I think if you're out of high school and you're going to be a PT, go to a state school. Don't rack up all that undergrad debt. And then when you go into PT school, perhaps it's not as bad. But I think there's also other programs that you can look at in your area or in your home state. Like, for instance, Jason Falvey grew up in Maine. And he had some program from his high school that if you graduated first or second in your class, you went to this undergraduate program for free, which he did. So he went to that for free. And then when he went to PT school, I feel like he did that somehow on scholarship or grants or things. So that was practically free. And then now he's getting his PhD at the University of Colorado at Denver, and the NIH is picking up the bill. So he actually learned how to sort of go through the system, being really creative and doing a lot of hard work. And is kind of practically free education.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point, Karen, is that one of the reasons why people go get their MD, PhD is because it's something that through the physician scientist training program, the NIH will pay for. And that is not an opportunity that we as physical therapists have. The NIH will not pay for a physical therapist scientist training program. And there are programs, I think, now that are developing dual DPT, PhD programs. I'm not really sure if they're, if you get your tuition discounted or something, if you blend the two programs. But that's something I would love to see in our profession because we need more this is another big problem we've heard. We need more academics. Because you need a terminal degree now to teach within a DPT program, we need more academics in those DPT programs. We're very short-staffed. There's not enough people to fill those positions. What better way to decrease debt and also increase the amount of available faculty that are qualified to teach by having a physical therapist scientist training program?
And on that note, we're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. PTs, what do you hope to accomplish in 2018? I bet providing even better patient care and increasing revenue are top on the list. First, expand your visit capacity. Then get paid for your services, ramp up patient engagement, and eliminate worries about documentation and compliance. The good news is there's one solution that brings it all to the table. ReDoc, powered by XFit, is a cloud-based, fully integrated EMR and billing solution. Imagine PT billing, coding, compliance experts taking the back office work off your hands and reporting to you. Learn more about ReDoc and complete revenue cycle management services at nethealth.com/healthy. So, F Scott, let's talk a little bit about what solutions there may be for the problem that you brought up, which was having some more interdisciplinary educational opportunities in school.
Yeah. Before we head there real quick, I just want to touch on one point that Steph brought up. And I think I'm going to preach it to my kids. I don't know if they'll listen, but, I did it pretty wrong in hindsight. I went to a private school, then I went to a state school, which wasn't terrible. Then I went back to a private school again. I'm going to preach that they go to community college for 2 years, then state school for 2 years, than probably any grad school they want at that point. Because realistically, at that point, it should be cheap enough that I should be able to cover that, for them. But, if I had to do it all over again, that's probably the path I would have taken. I just wanted to get out of New York. It was so cold. The winters were brutal. The cost of living was too high.
I live in New York.
Yeah, I know. I lived there my whole life. And when it snows on your birthday and it's April, it's time to go, But yeah,
it never snows on my birthday in Connecticut because my birthday's in July.
Yeah, real rough. I'm going to preach to my kids. I hope they listen. I don't know, but that's
they
the way
probably won't.
No. But as far as the interprofessional thing, I think realistically, there's been a couple of really good answers. And the one that kind of sticks out the most is to ditch lectures, get rid of lectures, and let's just get out into the clinic and do more rounding and clinical learning with the other professions in the real setting. More problem-based learning, and there's some medical schools that are doing this too. We had a couple of guests on that were heads of medical schools that are trying to get away from lectures completely and just go straight into community-based and problem-based learning, which I think is great. And I think, at that point, what do? You bring in the next person in line to help treat that patient, and you talk about how that's going to work. Realistically, I think we probably need to be doing a little bit more interprofessional lectures, though, as well. If we're going to keep that model, there needs to be more, where we both sit in the same classroom and maybe, work through a case study or something like that. That's been some of the kind of thoughts that there's been. And then at the end of the day, realistically, there just needs to be better interprofessionalism amongst healthcare, right? I mean, just everything we do needs to be supportive of each other and not bashing each other or tearing each other down or pointing fingers. Like, we just need to get back to patient-centric care and making sure that everybody's involved and knowing who to send somebody to and when in order to get the best possible patient outcomes at the end of the day. I know a lot of the people who said that we need more interprofessional collaboration basically said that healthcare needs to get back to a patient-centric view and patient-centric model. And if we do that, and we can all be positive and supportive, that should come naturally.
Yeah, I think that's incredible advice. And if you're not getting that interdisciplinary education in school, or even if you're in, a small outpatient clinic outside of a hospital, obviously in a hospital, you're going to get a lot of interdisciplinary communication. I would suggest making it a point to go to interdisciplinary conferences versus only going to an APTA conference or only a conference where there's physical therapists there, and going to conferences that are not taught by physical therapists, I think are at least some ways that we as clinicians can kind of open our minds a little bit. And then perhaps if you're a CI and you just went to an interdisciplinary conference, you can impart that onto your students, professors, things like that. So maybe we can if you make these little cracks in the pavement, they can become bigger and bigger.
Yeah, no, I love that advice, Karen. And I think, you're leading by example then too, right? Because you're also showing your students and your coworkers that, hey, like these are things we need to be doing. We need to be getting out of our own comfort zone, out of our own little bubble, and seeing what other providers are doing and what kind of value can be gained by attending a conference that's outside of your profession, for sure.
Absolutely. Okay, so we went through the things that maybe we can do better. So let's talk about the things now that you guys have discovered through your podcast that we're doing quite well.
I think a couple things, kind of going back to both anecdotal, my experience, but also kind of what I've learned from the podcast is that some things that I do think we do well is I think they cover the basics of a lot of the basic sciences and anatomy and movement within the basics of that. I think they do cover that very well with teaching some baseline skills. So I think that like being able to know those skills independently is pretty well covered. The problem is, how do you use it? How do you know what to do with those tools and how to use when for what, at what time, at what level of vigor? So I think, getting an overview of a lot of different avenues, because at the end of the day, I do understand that not everyone wants to be ortho, not everyone wants to be neuro, not everyone wants to be acute care. And there has to be this broad exposure, because at the end of the day, people are going to choose different routes. And that's okay. I mean, we're training them to be safe generalists to are safe to enter practice. I mean, at the end of the day. So I think we do a good job of getting some overview and kind of getting at what are some of the important things that we need to know on all these different avenues. Because even if you're in orthopedic practice, you're probably going to have to deal with some cardiopulmonary aspect at some point. You're probably going to see a neuro patient in some regard at some point. So you do need to have some background on everything to a degree. Now, you don't have to know all this specialty high level stuff to, all the time for, if you're treating someone for that. But if you need to have an understanding of the basics. So I think that's one thing that I've heard and I've experienced that they do really well right now.
And I would say that the thing that has impressed me a lot is I am so incredibly inspired by the innovation that goes on in healthcare education. I mean, we've had a lot of guests come on our show, and some of the things that they talk about on how they have implemented different things in their specific programs or with their patients or with their students are extremely innovative. And the fact that they're not mainstream just always blows my mind. So there are a lot of great innovative things going on in healthcare education. It's just not as widespread as I think that we would like it to see. I mean, we're millennials, so we want to see change super fast. And change is slow. So I think that is something that really inspires me and really helps me see that, there are these problems with healthcare education, but there are so many great solutions. Now it's just a matter of how do we implement them in a timely manner.
Yeah. And what are some examples of some things that were innovative that stood out to you?
Well, I think, John Childs' 2-year DPT program is a huge innovation within PT. And there are still a lot of people that are not on that train yet. But yet that's he saw this way sooner than many other people, or he was, the one that was brave enough to actually start moving in that direction and implement that. So that's one very well-known solution. We've mentioned a couple throughout this podcast just about, I know that Brandon had mentioned something that Janet Benzer had mentioned as far as a solution. So those are just a couple different examples, things that we've mentioned previously. John Childs' solution. We had a optometrist on our podcast a while back, and he talked about educating, doing some interprofessional collaboration with other healthcare professionals to help people with concussion by using these specific goggles. And I mean, that was probably one of the biggest episodes that just totally blew my mind. I never heard of that in my entire life. And yet here's this guy who has his own continuing education program through his company where you as a physical therapist can learn about this other solution to help people with concussion that's not being taught anywhere else. So those are probably a few examples that come to my mind off the top of my head.
Yeah, and to add on to that, getting onto some other different ones too, is we recently had a few people from Quinnipiac University's physical therapy program, because they have a unique clinical readiness program that they have implemented. So basically they go through a set of examples of clinical scenarios that are complex, and they critique the student. And if the student does well, they get to advance. If they don't, they remediate. And I really like that, because it's really trying to make it as real world as possible. And I think that's something I haven't seen done yet, and that they have it all structured. I like when we had the Columbia guys on, because they talked about their student-led elective. I think that was very innovative. I'd never heard of that. I think that's a fantastic idea that I think and that episode will be coming out in the near future, so people can have a listen to that. And then coming up down the road, we're also going to be talking with Kyle Covington and Carol Figures from Duke about their faculty residency as well. So I think those are all some other unique avenues of improvement and, some innovation I think need to be mentioned.
Awesome. And F Scott, we'll finish with you on what are we doing well?
I think one of the things that, physical therapy as a field is really starting to do well, kind of the vibe and the sense that I've gotten from our guests and our experts is self-awareness. I think that we're finally coming into our own, and we're owning our field as movement experts and, movement and musculoskeletal specialists. And I think that we're not, afraid to say that, yeah, we've had a branding problem as a field for a while now. We're self-aware enough to know, all right, this is our issue, but we're owning it too. And we're saying we're trying to do everything we can and trying to fix the view of physical therapy. And I think we're taking that self-awareness and we're trying to push it toward the public to do good things. No physical therapist that I know goes out with any sort of malintention or, looks to do wrong. We all want to help people get better, and we all think we have pretty good ideas on how to do that. And so I think, increasing the public's healthcare literacy and just doing the best we can to try to educate and using the best practice models and the best evidence that's out there in order to do that, it's finally starting to take shape. And I think, being self-aware has really been a pretty good step in the right direction for the field of physical therapy. We're not perfect, but we're working really hard to try to make it better every day.
Great. And I think that's a wonderful way to end our conversation on what we're doing well and maybe not so well. So thank you all so much for your contributions and for your podcast and for the interesting guests that you bring on. And I look forward to more. Now, before we end, I'm going to ask you all the same question. And that is, knowing where you are now in your life and in your career, what advice would you give to your younger self?
I'll take this one because this is a pretty easy one for me. Just don't be afraid. Just get out there and do it. Like Nike says, just do it. If you've got an idea or and you're afraid of criticism or anything, just go out and do it. Just try it. Worst case scenario, you learn from it. If it's a terrible flop, you learned how not to do it the next time. It's a pretty cliche phrase. I think it's Edison who said, I didn't fail when making the light bulb. I found 1,000 ways not to make the light bulb, right? It just literally do it. Take action, get out there, try your ideas, do it. Because at the end of the day, it's a learning process until you finally do get it right. At that point, it's a success. So yeah, don't be afraid. Just get out there and do.
I totally agree with that. And I'm going to build off that a little bit because that's going to kind of go into mine as something that I've always heard. And I really do understand it now is your network equals your net worth. So especially with what we've been able to achieve and who we've met throughout the process, just the ability to just get out there and talk with people, because you never know what you can accomplish and achieve when you talk with all these other people. Like it's amazing. To kind of add on a little bit to what you said, Scott, I would say another big thing I wish I could say to myself is I would also say don't be afraid, but also stay consistent and really focus and practice with the deliberate attempt always to work on getting really out of your comfort zone, because we're not going to grow if we aren't uncomfortable. So I think get comfortable being uncomfortable.
Great. And Steph, do you want to round it out for us?
Yeah. So I would say don't be afraid to ask for feedback. I think that it's really hard sometimes to look at yourself and be like, I'm not bad at that, or ignore something that's maybe a weakness for you. But I think that I have found as I've grown in my career that the times that I make probably the biggest strides with different projects that I'm doing, it's because I wasn't afraid to ask for honest feedback from people that I trusted. And probably in my younger days, that was something that was a lot harder for me. So that's probably the advice that I would give my younger self is ask for feedback from somebody that you trust.
Awesome. Well, you guys, I want to thank you so much, Brandon, F Scott, Stephanie, the co-hosts of the Healthcare Education Transformation podcast, for coming on my podcast and sharing everything that you've learned so far. And trust me, you're going to learn a lot more and you're going to meet a lot more people, and you never know where it's going to take you. So keep your mind open and keep your hearts open and just keep going forward. That would be my advice to you.
Well, thanks for having us on, Karen. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you, Karen.
Anytime. I would love to have you on again. So maybe we'll have to do this maybe in December or something. We'll do another podcast month. So thank you guys so much for coming on, and everyone else, thanks for tuning in. Have a great couple of days and stay healthy, wealthy, and smart. How great were they? How much do you now want to go check out the Healthcare Education Transformation podcast so you can listen to F Scott, Brandon, and Stephanie talk all day in your ears through their podcast? So a huge thanks to all of them for sharing everything that they've learned thus far. And of course, who doesn't also want to go check out Net Health? So if you want an EMR that's going to really work for you, then check out Net Health, which is Redoc powered by XFit. It's a cloud-based, fully integrated EMR and billing solution. Plus, you can opt in to completely outsource billing services. That's the best way to optimize revenue. So imagine PT, billing, coding, and compliance experts taking the back office work off your hands and reporting to you. This lets you do what you want to do with your business, which is treat your patients, grow your business, and meet more people. To learn more about Redoc and the complete revenue cycle management services, check them out at nethealth.com/healthy.
Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to the podcast at podcast.healthywealthysmart.com. And don't forget to follow us on social media.